There are a lot of DC Comics fans out there that are probably excited. They booked their tickets for San Diego Comic-Con 2022. Going to go see the booth, see the happenings, see all the big announcements for DC Comics, maybe the films and the related shows and all that stuff. And you are in for some bad news. Apparently, under David Zaslav, Warner Brothers Discovery have changed their approach to San Diego Comic-Con as far as their presence. And DC Comics is going to be very limited. Actually, everything Warner Brothers Discovery really will be limited based on the information that we have that did release out of the Hollywood Reporter today. But I do believe, for a few reasons, that DC Comics will be affected far more than any other property really at Warner Brothers Discovery as far as not having a presence at San Diego Comic-Con 2022. Let's get into all the details and talk about it. The freshly merged Warner Brothers Discovery is going to San Diego Comic-Con for the first time, and it's making some changes in its approach. Warner Brothers Discovery, headed by CEO David Zaslav, are making big changes to its approach to Comic-Con as Warner Brothers divisions make their first appearance at the annual pop culture celebration in 3 years. Due to pandemic reasons, for the first time, Warner's, including DC, will have no presence on the convention floor, a move that breaks with decades of precedent. The company had one of the bigger presence on the floor with movie and TV costumes on display. In some years, A-list stars such as the cast of Justice League or Watchmen appeared for sightings. A few years ago, people made kind of a big deal when Warner Brothers and the DC Comics presence, the booths at San Diego Comic-Con, kind of combined their efforts and kind of went to one central location. I personally thought that made a lot of sense as far as synergy within the company and branding and marketing efforts. You know, the DC Comics characters do show up in the Warner Brothers movies and whatnot. Some people kind of made a big deal out of it, saying, is this the death of DC Comics? Are they going to shut down their publishing efforts in the near future? I thought it was kind of hogwash then, although this does make me a little bit more nervous because what is typically the biggest promotion for DC Comics in any given year really is their presence at Comic-Con, specifically San Diego Comic-Con being the really big one where they had the enormous presence and they put a lot of money in there, got the word out about their publishing efforts. Let people know that, hey, if you like this character from the movie or you like this character from a TV show, we've got these comic books, and kind of got the word out. Obviously, it hasn't done enough, but at least it was probably getting some awareness of what DC Comics were doing out there because they virtually have no marketing budget. There's no marketing put into DC Comics outside of really house ads. If you're not reading DC Comics, you have no idea what they're doing. So I think this could be very negative as far as impacting future sales and awareness of DC Comics. It's still unclear what Warner's theatrical divisions will bring, as those plans are still being hashed out. According to multiple insiders, the studio has a number of DC films due out later this year, such as DC League of Super Pets, Black Adam, and Shazam! Fury of the Gods, all of which open in July, October, and December, respectively. These could all make appearances. Movies that are open in 2023, such as The Flash and Blue Beetle, will not have panels regardless of the presence, as they are considered too far out for any panel to have a meaningful impact. Not surprisingly, David Zaslav is going to use his marketing efforts and the money he has available to him as he tries to downsize a lot of the spending within Warner Brothers Discovery, and he's going to focus all that effort into the movies where you have a lot more revenue return as far as your investments and whatnot. Obviously, the monetary investments just making these films is a lot riskier than it is when it comes to comic books. But one of the things that movies really have going for them, they really don't need San Diego Comic-Con for awareness. Obviously, if you have the big panel and you have one of the actors show up and maybe they bring out an artifact from a cool story and let people know that's what they're doing, kind of like Robert Downey Jr. all those years ago, that can really generate a lot of buzz and headlines and excitement. But even if they didn't have that, you're still going to have the trailer. The trailer is still going to be on YouTube. The trailer is still going to be in front of every major action movie for the summer and all that stuff to get people really excited about what you're putting out there. You know, with TV shows, you're still going to have advertisements advertising the show to let people know that they're there. You just don't get that kind of awareness and that kind of promotion when it comes to the comic books. Not surprisingly, they are putting their efforts more into the movies, even though they don't really need that kind of promotion like a DC Comics would at San Diego Comic-Con. But, you know, at this point, they've already put the money into the movies. And I imagine they're very desperate to get a nice big return on those investments. So not surprising that the movies themselves will still have a big presence. Obviously, that's still to be determined, but you're definitely going to get some big trailers, some exclusive content and stuff like that, and likely some presence somewhere besides just a panel or two. DC Publishing, despite not having a booth, which always attracted a crowd and had talent milling about, will still have a presence via a smattering of panels. DC publisher and CCO Jim Lee will headline a showcase of upcoming DC books with sneak peeks and creators. There will be a panel stacked with Batman-centric comics writers and artists, while superstar writers Tom Taylor and Tom King will have a conversation about their work, past, present, and future. Also in the lineup is a panel on DC's current event miniseries, Dark Crisis, among others. We definitely knew DC Comics were going to do something with Dark Crisis at San Diego Comic-Con. We saw that within the solicitations for September of 2022. Supposedly, there's a very big announcement that's going to come out there. It is a bit disappointing that really the only other thing that appears to be getting a lot of publicity or marketing as far as the limited panels that DC Comics are getting is Batman. I don't think we have a problem getting people aware of Batman and what DC Comics are doing with that character, but he is the moneymaker. He really seems to be the only priority for DC Comics as a whole under Jim Lee. And I imagine a lot of DC Comics fans that like characters outside of Batman are going to be very disappointed, especially if they already bought their tickets and maybe they already made their plans, excited to get kind of back to normal since things have been so weird for the last few years. And then to kind of get this news and find out, oh, great, the only covers we're really getting about DC Comics is Dark Crisis, which obviously is going to have a lot of Batman connections with characters and whatnot, or Batman, or a conversation between two Batman writers, or Jim Lee, who appears to really only focus on the character of Batman. So I feel for you, but I do hope that Jim Lee, during his panel, it sounds like they're going to talk about some other stuff. Maybe they'll talk about Superman. It sounds like they got some big plans for Clark Kent finally returning to Earth from Warworld, teaming up with John Kent in some type of a crossover book between Action Comics and Superman, Son of Kal-El, including Steel, John Henry Irons, which I think is a really cool character. I hope they do him proud. But there's just not a lot of buzz around DC Comics. I don't really blame Zaslav for making this decision. I hate to say it, but I think if the accountants start looking closely at the revenue generators and how much money is invested in compared to returns and whatnot, I just don't think it's going to look good on DC Comics, especially this past year, year and a half. Ever since Future State came out, it feels like just the buzz around DC has been terrible. They haven't had a lot of really good stories out there. Do I think the publishers in danger of just shutting down or maybe just going to reprints or even licensing out, DC Comics characters and whatnot? I don't really think so, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. There is new leadership there. One of David Zaslav's stated goals is cutting costs. If I wanted to save money, one easy way would be to stop publishing DC Comics. If you just shut the publisher down, hired a few lawyers, maybe a couple other people to work with them, and just license out the characters, it would cut down costs tremendously, and you would just have revenue coming in from DC Comics characters while still making a ton of money just off on the licensing efforts when it comes to stuff outside of comic books, like lunchboxes and posters and underwear and stuff like that. I don't think they would save a tremendous amount of money, like shutting down a part of their studio or maybe shutting down some of their gaming efforts, which I do think they were trying to farm out anyway. But they could certainly make DC Comics a lot more profitable with a lot less overhead and work involved to make that money if they chose to. And I wouldn't be surprised if David Zaslav was at least thinking about it. It sounds like DC Comics characters are very important to their movie efforts, to their streaming efforts, and things of that nature, because I think he wants to make a whole lot of money and he wants to get a whole lot of people subscribing to HBO Max. DC Comics really isn't going to do that. There's not a whole lot of awareness generated about the movies, about the shows and stuff, just from the comic books themselves. If anything, it's kind of reverse. You're making new fans based on the other material, and you hope they come in for the comics. But that strategy really isn't working. So I don't think it's going to happen, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did. If they just said, you know what, we're limiting DC's publishing efforts to 12 comics a month, or we're cutting off DC publishing efforts and we're going to license out the characters, or we're just going to do reprints, stuff like that. Because financially, if you hear what Zaslav is doing, it kind of makes sense. Insiders say the Comic-Con revamp is designed to make the company be more strategic in its approach, but it also comes as Zaslav has been focusing on the bottom line, reportedly seeking $3 billion in savings for the new company. In past years, Comic-Con has cost Warner's $25 million plus, factoring in the floor installation, travel for its talent, and tech costs for its high-level presentations. When you think about $3 billion worth of savings, I mean, that's not talking about we want to generate $3 billion more in revenue. We want to spend $3 billion less than we were before. Saving $25 million in the big scheme of things isn't a big deal. That's like pennies on the dollar when you're talking about $3 billion. But David Zaslav and the people at Warner Brothers Discovery thought that it was a good idea, and strategically it made sense to save that $25 million. And that's one of the reasons I'm starting to get concerned about the long-term health and viability of DC Comics, because the revenue generated probably just isn't there, and the cost savings, while it wouldn't be a whole lot in comparison to that $3 billion stated goal that they're working towards, it would be something. And it sounds like they're trying to cut costs anywhere that they can, including their presence at Sandiego Comic-Con. DC Comics is the oldest publisher in America, and they're not even going to have a presence at the biggest Comic-Con in America. I don't know that this particularly spells doom for DC Comics, but I do know that it can't be good, right? There's no way that you can kind of spin this and say, well, it's really good news. Either it means nothing and it was just benign and it just happened to happen to DC Comics, or this could be one of the first signs that maybe DC Comics really aren't in the long-term strategic plans as far as comic book publishing, like their characters and other efforts are within movies and streaming and whatnot. So I do feel bad for any DC Comics fans that were excited to some return to normalcy, going to go to Sandiego Comic-Con for the first time in several years. We're going to go see that DC Comics panel, the booths and all that stuff, and see all the publicity and marketing, maybe see some of the cool presentations that they have. And it turns out there's just not going to be much there. There's going to be a few panels, and that's basically it. One thing David Zaslav and company are going to notice when they start looking at the books for DC Comics is they can't sell any character right now outside of Batman. Just 3 or 4 years ago, that wasn't the case, but terrible creative decisions under Jim Lee and his editorial staff have just destroyed the sales of every character outside of Batman himself. All of this could have been prevented, could have been fixed, but they keep going down this terrible directions. Definitely check this out. Josh and I lay it all out.